Hello, my name is Kelly Tebow, and I'm with the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, and I will be your organizer for this evening and would like to welcome you to our webinar on using positive psychology to find more happiness every day. Thank you all for joining us. Before I have my colleague introduce the speaker for tonight, I'm going to cover some housekeeping items with you. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please type it in the bottom of your question box and click send. Dr. Shcherbakov will answer questions at the end of his presentation, and we will get to as many queries as time allows. In addition, tonight's presenter is available to take your questions on the Wednesday webinar blog, which is accessed from our homepage under the heading Programs. This blog will be monitored for the next 7 days. Feel free to look and post questions as often as you like. Answers will be archived for future reference. If you missed part of the presentation or would like to watch it again, an archive version will be posted to our website. We value your input, and in order to expand the webinar experience in the future, we need everyone attending to fill out the survey when you exit the webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now, I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker to Barbara Chabner, the Program Manager of NJCTS. Barbara?
Thanks, Kelly, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Dr. Anton Shcherbakov is a licensed psychologist at the Center for Emotional Health of Greater Philadelphia, a private outpatient facility specializing in the evidence-based treatment of anxiety disorders, body-focused repetitive behaviors, and obsessive-compulsive and related disorders. He is also a board-certified behavior analyst and director of ThinkPsych, an agency focused on improving educational outcomes for students with autism spectrum disorder by creating research-backed products for special education. Dr. Shcherbakov has previously presented at local and national conferences on topics that include reducing maladaptive behaviors in autism spectrum disorder, treating body-focused repetitive behaviors, and evaluating provider attitudes towards evidence-based treatment. He received his doctorate in clinical psychology from the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University in 2016. Dr. Shcherbakov's dissertation explored the role of stigma towards adults with autism spectrum disorder in the workplace. It's my pleasure to bring to you tonight Dr. Anton Shcherbakov to talk about using positive psychology to find more happiness every day.
All righty. Well, thank you, Barbara, for that introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today, for spending some part of your evening with me. I'm really excited to be talking about positive psychology and how you can apply some of the findings, frog in my throat, how you can apply some of the findings from this research to your everyday life. I think there's so much in this field of research that's really applicable to all of us. And I know this is something that I hear a lot about in my clinical practice in terms of folks, asking me, how can I be more happy? How can I help my kids to live happy, meaningful lives? And so hopefully I'm able to share some of that with you all today. So let me begin by just going through a brief outline of what I'm going to cover. So first, I'm going to talk about what positive psychology is and how it's distinguished from the field of psychology more broadly. We'll talk about a very brief history of how it actually came to be. We'll talk about what happiness is and why it actually might be important. We'll also talk about what doesn't make us happy, and notably money, which might come as a surprise to some, but probably not all of you. We'll talk about the field's movement from happiness as a real focus to well-being as the main focus of positive psychology. Then we'll talk about some simple ways to increase well-being that actually are research-based. That studies have shown us, some of these really simple, easy to integrate exercises can really improve our well-being in measurable ways. I'll share some resources so that you can follow up on this webinar and learn more about positive psychology. And lastly, we'll wrap up with a gratitude practice. And what you'll need for that practice is just a piece of paper, a pen or pencil, or you can even write on your phone. It doesn't really matter. I saved that actually towards the end, just because I know some folks, because of whatever situation they're watching the webinar in, they might not actually be able to sit down and do that. Some of you are probably cooking dinner and watching this, or doing something with your family. So I totally understand that, and so that's why I kind of save it towards the end. All right, so without further ado, let's talk about what positive psychology is. I really like this definition from one of the founders of the field. It's a little bit wordy, but I think it really captures the essence of positive psychology. And that is, positive psychology is the scientific study of optimal human functioning that aims to discover and promote the factors that allow individuals and communities to thrive. And I bolded that last part because that's really such an important part of positive psychology as it exists today. It's really this focus on thriving, right? Not just surviving, not just living, not just being, free of mental illness or maladies, but really about thriving and growing and expanding. And while this seems like a pretty obvious direction perhaps for psychology to be going in, for psychology to be researching, this was actually something that was pretty novel to the field of psychology more broadly, because for much of I'll say for clinical psychology, for much of clinical psychology's history, the focus has been on disease or disorders such as anxiety and depression, schizophrenia, Tourette's disorder, and things like that, right? And there was this implicit idea that if we can just treat disease, if we can just treat disorder, help people to attain a higher level of functioning and reduce their symptoms, then their well-being is going to increase. But really, the thinking has shifted in recent years that that's actually not enough, that well-being is not simply the absence of disorder, but it actually is something that is a lot more holistic and a little bit more complex than that. And interestingly, up until the late 90s, very little attention had actually been paid in the research in terms of what made people happy or what helped them to live what they described as fulfilling lives. And so Martin Seligman, who sort of interestingly actually is a very prominent depression researcher, he proposed the theory of learned helplessness to explain, it's like a behavioral model of depression that is seen as one of the most prominent ones in the field. And in doing that research, really focusing on depression and animal studies, he ended up becoming the president of the American Psychological Association. And in starting his term, he said, we really need to shift our attention from not just focusing on things like depression and disorders, but really thinking about what does it mean to live, quote unquote, the good life? What does that actually mean? And let's study that. Let's bring empirical attention to it. And that's really what he did. And so since that time, a lot of research has actually been done in this field. And it's really only the past 20 years or so. So it's kind of amazing how young some of this work is. And so, I think the first question we really need to address is, first, what is happiness? As psychologists, as researchers, we have to define our terms so that, we're on the same page about what that is. And then we'll talk a little bit about why it actually might be important. Because I bet there's some of you in the audience that might actually disagree with that maybe happiness isn't the most important thing. And actually, I agree with you, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But first, we define happiness as the frequent experience of positive emotions, such as joy, interest, pride, right? And rather infrequent experiences of negative emotions, such as sadness, anxiety, and anger. And so this is a really important point to kind of touch on for a moment, that when we talk about happiness, when someone describes themselves as generally being happy, they're not necessarily saying that they don't experience negative emotions. And in fact, the total absence of negative emotions is oftentimes associated with psychopathology, with various disorders, when there is a significant suppression or repression of negative emotions. That's usually not very healthy. And so I bring this up because this has been a frequent criticism of this field and some of the work that's been done here, because I think the misunderstanding is that, the researchers in this field are saying, well, look, we all just need to be happy. Happiness is really important. La la la, everything's fine. There's nothing bad in the world. But that's really not it, right? It's about that balance, right? And some research has suggested, although there's been some contradictory points there, that and basically there has to be a much higher frequency of positive emotions to negative emotions in order for us to flourish, right? For us to grow, to generally feel content and happy with our lives. And there was some empirical research that picked a specific number. Actually, I don't remember exactly what it was. It was 3.8 or 4, positive emotions for every negative emotion. But that research has since been pretty heavily criticized and not being all that mathematically accurate. But the general principle is actually right, that there should be quite a bit more positive emotion compared to negative emotion. So hopefully that that point is clear, that the goal here is not for everyone to just be walking bag of sunshine all the time, but to have a heavier emphasis on that side as opposed to the negative emotion side. All right, and so what happens when people do experience that higher balance of positive emotions? Well, some of the outcomes in the literature are absolutely, amazing when we actually look at these correlations and also some causal relationships between happiness and life outcomes. The first is folks who report greater happiness report better mental health. That's probably not surprising, but also better physical health outcomes. Right? And so, some people, when hearing this research, ask, well, is it the chicken or the egg, right? Are people happy because they have good physical health, or do they have good physical health because they are happy? And actually, it's a little bit of both, is what the research tells us, which is really interesting, right? So folks who are, who at point A, let's say at 18 years old, report experiencing greater positive emotions, then at time point B, 5, 10, 15 years later, actually also report better physical health. That happiness seems to have some sort of a protective effect, because it seems to encourage people to engage in more health promoting behaviors like eating healthy, going to the gym, and things like that. Of course, on the flip side, right, if your health is good, you're also more likely to be happy. But that's actually not a requirement for happiness, right? I think of one prominent example of Stephen Hawkins, who was diagnosed with ALS or Lou Gehrig's syndrome at, I think he was 21 or something like that. And interestingly, when you listen to interviews with him, he talked about being actually pretty happy and pretty grateful for being alive, because he was told he wasn't going to have a very long life. And so, while physical health is oftentimes, associated with or an outcome of being happy, it is not a requirement for being happy. Although, well, it certainly helps. The last point I'd like to make here is that folks who are happy also tend to actually live longer. They tend to, have not only less illness in their lives, but also tend to have a longer lifespan as well. Secondly, and kind of related to this first point, folks who report greater levels of happiness also have greater resilience to stressful events, right? If you're generally happy and something bad happens to you, like a global pandemic, for example, you're going to have greater resilience to that stressful event, as opposed to folks who are not experiencing that greater balance of happiness. And I think that makes pretty intuitive sense. Folks who are happy also tend to report more and better quality relationships, right? And there's a bi-directional relationship here as well, in that, when you are happy, you tend to, seek out relationships and foster those relationships. And on the flip side, having those relationships also enhances your feelings of happiness, right? So it kind of goes both ways. And lastly, this too, I think, is an interesting point. There is this criticism of the field that this focus on individual happiness can lead to folks being really selfish, right? And being really focused on themselves and, what's going to make me happy, right? But the research actually doesn't bear that out. Folks who report high levels of happiness actually seem to also experience greater job success, greater job satisfaction, right? So they seem to be engaged in their workplaces, whatever those are. They also seem to be more involved in their community. They tend to donate more to charity. They tend to be more involved in their religious organizations, school boards, things like that. And so, hopefully, as I'm kind of going through all these reasons as to why happiness might be important, you really start to see it in the way that I do, which is that in a lot of ways, happiness is like a public health issue, in that if we can improve, our countries, our world's levels of happiness, we can have so many cascading downstream effects from that, right? Almost in this sort of like virtuous cycle where the happier people get, the more positive things start happening around them and to their communities as well. So that's, a lot of really big things that are associated with happiness, right? And so an important kind of side note here, I'm assuming most folks here are tuning in from the United States. And so I think we're all part of the same culture, right? One that really tends to value material goods and money as markers of success and as some sort of a pathway to happiness. I think most of us believe intuitively that having more money will make us happier. And yet intellectually, I think on some level also question that idea that, it doesn't seem that money does always make folks happier, because we can think of plenty of counterexamples of very, very wealthy folks, celebrities and things like that, who don't seem all that happy despite their, unbelievable fortunes. And so researchers in the field of positive psychology have actually looked at this through studies to see, does money make us happier? When does that, is there a limit to how happy it makes us and stuff like that? And so as you see on my slide here, I have a little asterisk next to, more money not making us happy. And that is true with a caveat. And the caveat is that money does make us happier up to a certain point. So what this graph is showing us at the bottom here, what's called the x-axis, income is increasing, right? From around 10,000 to 160,000. And then the percentage of people that agree with a variety of statements is reflected on this y-axis over here. So don't worry if you're not too brushed up on your graph interpretation, because I'll break it down. But basically what this graph is showing us is that, when folks are in a very low income range, right, their happiness is notably different than folks who are, actually I'll look at this line over here, is notably different from folks who are in a higher income range, right? And that makes intuitive sense that, when you don't have enough money to, well, survive, to make ends meet, to pay your bills, to put food on the table, you're obviously not going to be all that happy, and you're going to be reporting a great deal of stress. Surprisingly, even people at a relatively low income range in the poverty, below the poverty line, are still saying that, about 70% of them are happy much of the time, right? That's what that positive affect line is showing us. But that happiness does increase up until about this point, which is around $75,000, $80,000, where you can see this line really goes flat. And what that line is showing us is that as people's income doubles from $80,000 a year to $160,000 a year, and actually well beyond, they are not reporting significantly higher levels of happiness. And they're not reporting significantly lower levels of stress either, right? So the number of people reporting being relatively stress-free increases up until about 75, 80,000, and then evens out, right? And so what is this telling us? Well, you know, having a certain level of money to feel comfortable, to feel secure that, you know, we're not in danger of missing our rent payments or, you know, having a financial crisis is important in order for us to feel secure and happy. But those effects really start to diminish as you get beyond a certain threshold. I will just say this as another caveat, which is that, you know, these are national results for the United States from a 2010 study over here. Obviously, what qualifies as enough income changes somewhat, you know, where you are in the United States. And, you know, the studies that have broken it out a little bit more by geographic region, when looking at like the Northeast, the number of where, you know, more money doesn't make you any happier is a little bit higher in the Northeast. That's somewhere between, you know, $100,000 to $120,000 a year. But still, you know, there is always a point of diminishing returns, and that's really the main takeaway. The last thing that I will say on this slide is this purple line, which you may notice continues to increase with income. And that's the way that people, you know, evaluate their life and how successful they have been. So that does continue to increase with income. That kind of makes sense given the culture that we're in, right? Where so often how successful we feel is tied to our salary, to our income, right? All right, so hopefully all of that is clear. Just kind of remembering the main takeaway that, you know, money, again, I think somewhat intuitively, does not increase happiness beyond a certain point. All right, so we've been talking a lot about happiness, and I sort of had suggested earlier that, you know, happiness is just one part of the picture, and that's really where the field of positive psychology has gone as well, that in recognizing how important happiness is, you know, these researchers also realize that it's only a part of the picture, right? Feeling positive emotions is important, but it's only one small part of what actually leads to, you know, a whole view of well-being, of what, you know, truly is the good life. And so Martin Seligman proposed this model, which I'll walk through. The model is called PERMA, and all the letters stand for different facets of well-being. So let's talk through those one by one, a little bit of detail, and then I'll jump into them in more detail individually. So P stands for positive emotion, which is happiness, right? We already talked a little bit about that. Engagement, also another word used in this field that I'll talk about is flow, or being absorbed in something, having activity that really like sucks you in and, you know, makes you feel like you're, you know, kind of timeless in a way. We'll talk about what that means. Relationships, right? Having relationships, having quality, meaningful relationships is such an important part of what it means to be well, to have well-being and have a good life. We'll talk about meaning, right? And, you know, the purpose that people derive from their lives, that's important. And lastly, achievement as well. Which is one of the components of this model that's probably achieved or received some of the most criticism, and we'll talk about why. But let's dive into them a little bit, one at a time here. So positive emotions. I don't know about you all, but I love kittens. That's one of the things that gives me a great deal of positive emotions. I have 2 cats, and you know, they roll over on their backs like that, and you could, you know, rub their tummy. It's just, it's one of the most delightful things on the planet, right? And so, you know, part of cultivating a life that is, you know, the good life is making an active effort to seek activities that promote positive emotions. And surprisingly, for many of us, this doesn't come intuitively. I mean, it's so unintuitive in some ways that, you know, there's this whole sort of movement around this idea of self-care, that this is something that we as humans should actually prioritize, right? To take the time out to actually care and nourish ourselves. I don't know if anyone watches Parks and Rec, but I love the, there's two characters on the show who one of their like slogans is like treat yourself. And that really epitomizes what self-care and promoting positive emotions is all about, right? And it could be any number of things, as simple as, taking a bubble bath, listening to music, dancing, playing with a pet, eating a special meal, talking to a friend, watching a funny movie, buying something that makes you happy. People talk about retail therapy, which as a psychologist, I partially endorse, be careful with that, gets expensive. So, this is an important part of living a good life, is taking the time out to do things that are simply pleasurable. But of course, I think all of us can realize what the downfall of the original, just exclusive focus on happiness is. So if you just took this list, expanded it to maybe 100 things that make you feel good, and made that your life, I don't know that that would by itself be the good life, right? In fact, that would be a pretty shallow, in some ways actually kind of sad life, if all you did was just things that made you feel good and you didn't do some of the other things that we'll talk about. And so this is just a broader idea of well-being than just this. So let's move on to engagement, which goes by another name called flow. This term flow was coined by a psychologist, and is a very difficult to pronounce name. I'm going to do my best at it. It's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Don't ask me how to spell that. There's even more consonants than there are in my name. But basically, this psychologist did a bunch of research in the, it started in the late 80s, I think, early 90s, even before the positive psychology movement started. And what he was really interested in is this human experience that's common to all of us, where we get so involved in an activity that we enjoy it like very intensely, and we almost feel like we're losing track of time. People often talk about these sort of activities as being their passion, as something that they can do sort of endlessly. There's just kind of a timeless kind of quality to them, right? And they can be activities like playing an instrument. They could be, for a computer programmer, writing code. They could be, dancing or ice skating. It could be a physical activity. It could be a mental activity. For some folks, that's like solving math problems or doing crossword puzzles and stuff like that. And so this, research suggests that this sort of experience is a really important part of well-being, that we need to have at least some portion of our day, ideally much or many portions of our day, where we get pulled into this sense of timelessness, where we are in what psychologists call the flow channel, right? This area over here. And I'll explain what this means. So on the left-hand side over here, on the y-axis, we have challenge. And on the bottom x-axis over here, we have skills, right? And so the way this shakes out is when we're doing an activity that is not very challenging, is low in challenge, but our skills are also low, we might be in the flow channel. So for me, for example, I like to tinker with cars. I'm not very good at it. My skill level is pretty low. When I'm doing a task that's relatively easy, like for example, changing the oil, I can get a lot of enjoyment out of it and really be kind of sucked into it, although that's kind of a bad example because it's a very quick thing. But that's something where I might really get into flow, where I'm sort of just, rocking and rolling, I might call it. Now, on the flip side, if you go into a situation that is very high in challenge, but you're still low in skills, you're going to experience a great deal of anxiety, and that is not going to feel good, right? If for some reason I had to, rebuild a transmission on a car, my anxiety doing that would be very, very high, because again, my skill level is very, very low. And I would not be feeling good. I'd be feeling very stressed out, and it'd be a very unpleasant experience that would inevitably lead to a call for a tow truck and, asking my mechanic to please fix what I've done. On the flip side, if your skill level is really, really high, so let's say you are a an award-winning architect, right? And it's really like your craft and you're so good at architecture, and you're asked to do something that is like super easy. Like, I don't know, this isn't even something architects would do, but let's say designing like a phone booth or designing, you know, a bench or something like that. For most architects, I imagine, who are very skilled, that would be a pretty boring kind of activity, right? To get into that flow channel, once your skill level gets high, you want to be doing something that's pretty challenging, right? So if you're a highly skilled architect, developing, you know, a new type of structure would be something that would be really challenging and really interesting and bring you into that flow channel. And so where am I going with all this? Well, the point is we want to try to incorporate activities into our daily life that keep us in this flow channel, right? Where we are sort of matching the level of skill that we have in a task with the level of challenge that we have in it. So we can feel that experience of absorption, of growth, of passion, right? Because that not only does that feel really good, but it also connects to some of those other things like, you know, that meaning or purpose that we'll talk about, right? And so, you know, this is something that I want you all kind of like thinking about, like, what are those things that might give me that sense of flow or engagement in my life? I will say a caveat here. So many people talk about, you know, being lost in, let's say, Netflix, you know, sitting and watching TV for a really long time, or some other kind of passive activity. Now, according to the psychologists that study this, that actually wouldn't really be flow. And part of that is because you are not being challenged anyway, right? It's not really hard to watch Netflix. There's no skill involved. It's a very low challenge and, well, zero skill activity. It doesn't require you doing anything. That's a very different type of being lost in time. And the way you can distinguish the difference is think about how you feel after being lost in Netflix for 8 hours versus how you feel after being lost in, let's say, gardening, you know, your garden for 8 hours, right? So for me, after I watch Netflix for 8 hours, I get up and I'm like, oh, what have I done with my life? That was seriously, I can't believe I just did that. Versus, you know, getting up from doing something I really enjoy for 8 hours and thinking like, wow, that was so productive. I feel so good about that, right? And that's one way that you can tell whether you're in flow or sort of just pressing fast forward on your time. So hopefully that that distinction is clear. And I will say, you know, as long as there's some sort of challenge or activeness, active quality to the behavior, it could be flow. So I think some folks experience that while playing video games, which is a form of entertainment, right? It doesn't have to be something that's necessarily like productive or constructive in the traditional sense. You know, for folks who are kind of like career athletes, for them, you know, playing football, they would be in that flow channel for much of that time. So there's no reason why it can't be a game, but it can't be something passive. All right, moving on to relationships. So research suggests that it may be the single most important contributing factor to well-being, right? That when researchers take a look at what really contributes to folks reporting that long-lasting, deep sense of well-being and happiness, relationships are almost always at the top of that list. And importantly, it's not the quantity of relationships that's important, but their quality and frequency, meaning how often you're engaging with those individuals, right? It doesn't matter if you have 50 friends or 2, but if those 2 friendships that you have are deep and you have regular engagement with that person, they can provide you, you know, very much value, as much as, you know, having many more times that number of relationships. And I really like this quote from this Harvard study that was what's called the longitudinal study. So looking over, you know, many years. I think they followed folks for something like 80 years, like shortly either before World War II or shortly after World War II. And, you know, this quote says, close relationships more than money or fame are what keep people happy throughout their lives. Close relationships protect people from life's discontents, help to delay mental and physical decline, and are better predictors of long and happy lives than social class, IQ, or even genes, right? So this is so important. And yet, for many of us, we tend to de-emphasize the importance of this in our daily lives as we get so preoccupied with all the other things, all the other responsibilities and, our achievement seeking or accomplishment seeking. And yet so important to think about how relationships really impact all of these different elements of our lives, our physical and mental health, our happiness, and so on. And so I also wanted to share the results of this time poll. It's a little bit dated now. I think it was done in 2005 or 2006, but still kind of drives that point home. When you ask folks to pick one thing in their life that's brought them the greatest happiness, most folks report, relationships, children, family. Some folks report God, faith, religion, their spouse, right? But you can see it's so heavily centered on those intimate family relationships. And then when you ask them about their major sources of happiness, again, it's those same things that come up: their relationship with children, their friendships, contributing to the lives of others, relationship with spouse, etc. And lastly, again, to drive the point home, when we ask people what they do often to improve their mood, talking to friends or family is at the top of the list for both men and women. That's what the two bars indicate. So again, not to belabor it any more than it needs to be belabored, but just thinking about really cultivating, nurturing, and ensuring that relationships are really front and center for you if your goal is to improve your well-being. All right, meaning. I have this book cover. Maybe some folks in the audience have read it, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's such a really good book on this topic. Viktor Frankl is a psychologist who spent time in the Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust, and he really talks about trying to make sense of that experience, about finding meaning in this time of immense and unbelievable suffering and cruelty that he's experiencing. And the modern research suggests that meaning is a really important part of what constitutes well-being, right? That dedicating ourselves to a cause that's higher than us in some way is a really important way of creating a meaningful, well, I'm using the word meaning in the same sentence, a good life, right? The good life, so to speak. And there can be all sorts of different ways to find this type of meaning, right? Being involved with religion, with our communities, providing service, raising a family. These are all different ways that we can find meaning or purpose in our lives. And, kind of thinking back to just this initial focus on positive emotions, right? Those who seek positive emotions without also seeking meaning tend to not really experience lasting well-being, right? To just chase, pleasures of the flesh, so to speak, leads to a relatively hollow and in some ways, I think, disappointing life. And so thinking about for ourselves what our purpose is, what are the activities that give us a sense of meaning, right, is a really important part of cultivating that well-being. And then let me talk a little bit about achievement as well. So this is another area of the model that has really attracted some criticism. And Seligman has really been criticized for kind of bringing what seems to be like a more Western value of focus on achievement and ambition, accomplishing things as being a part of well-being. And there's some Eastern traditions, both philosophical and religious, that would kind of think about this differently, that achievement really isn't an important part of the good life. But for what it's worth, it's part of the model. And I do agree that I think, achieving things, both big and small, is a really important component of well-being. And I think these are often really tied to that purpose or that meaning that we have in our lives, right? Finding those small things that we can do that either bring us more in line pull us towards our purpose, to our meaning in life. Or even just, having small achievements that just give us that sense of satisfaction, like, oh, I did something today, right? I know for me, even really small things can make me feel pretty good, right? Going through a box of files that, I was overdue for sorting, or, doing a new project with my car, or, fixing something around the house, right? Setting those sort of goals and then achieving them feels really good, right? Most of us, if we make to-do lists, it feels really good to check things off of that list. And so, Seligman really talks about how striving for these goals and ultimately achieving them helps us to have this sense of life satisfaction. And it is something that we should be thinking about. And I already said this, but it can be closely connected to our sense of meaning. All right, so let's review. So going from that initial focus on just positive emotions or happiness, and really expanding the model to now think about well-being and what's kind of encompassed in that. And PERMA is our roadmap. So I encourage you all, I challenge you all to take an honest sort of look at your life using this PERMA model, and see where you stand, right? Look at the P element. What is my balance of positive emotions? Do I take the time to treat myself and to do things that make me feel good? Engagement. Are there things in my life, whether it's at work, at home, in my leisure time, on the weekend, that really pull me in, that I can get lost in for hours and hours at a time because I derive some sense of passion or pleasure from it? How am I doing with my relationships? Am I cultivating, am I nourishing those? Whether it's with my immediate family, my children, my friends, colleagues, etc. Right? All of these relationships can be important and meaningful to us. Taking a look at, what you have set out as, or what you see as like your purpose or your meaning in life. I see too often people kind of like avoiding this question because it's a hard one to answer. It's so ambiguous, and it's different for everyone. But really thinking about this, one way to kind of tune into this is, asking yourself, what would you want people to say about you at your funeral if they were giving a eulogy, right? Sometimes that can help us to kind of think about what's most important to us and what we want to, what we want to strive for, what, gives us a sense of that meaning or purpose, right? And it might be that, I want to be the best dad that I can be. I want to be there for my kids and, support them and help them to grow into like the best adults that they can. And maybe that's really like the main driving force for you, and that's totally fine. Maybe it is to, help those less fortunate than you, to do some sort of community outreach, to feed, the hungry, or help the homeless or something like that, right? These could all be areas of meaning or purpose. And lastly, what are your goals in life? What are the things that you want to accomplish? You can sort of work backward from that purpose or that meaning, right? And it could be small things. Maybe this year I want to volunteer at the soup kitchen at least 3 times, right? And maybe that's, stretching the idea of achievement a little bit, but I would call that a goal and an achievement to do so, to make time for that, right? If you feel like you're lacking this element in your life of it, setting out goals and achieving them, that's an important place to problem solve. Are your goals too large and too difficult to achieve? Are you not setting enough goals, etc.? All right, so some simple ways to increase well-being. So I'm just being mindful of time here. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly so we can make sure that we get to the gratitude activity. So all these are research-based or evidence-based strategies that help to improve mood and improve well-being. So this first one is just recalling positive life events. For those of us whose entire memories are not stored on computers, you can look through a photo album, right? Who has those anymore? Opening that up, whether it's digitally or in print, and like looking back at, past vacations, your, wedding photos if you're married, looking at pictures of your kids when they were young, looking at pictures of yourself when you were young, taking the time to actually just think about positive things that happened in the past. That can, bring up some of those positive emotions, and also help to kind of tap into that sense of meaning and purpose, because it can remind us of, why we did or do certain things. Another research-backed strategy is doing acts of kindness. So pretty consistently, studies show us that when we buy a gift for someone else, we give it to someone else, it actually makes us feel better than if we buy that same sort of gift for ourselves. This might be surprising to some of you and maybe not to others, but we're all coming off the holiday season here, and this is like the tail end, so maybe the memories of giving the gifts are a little bit more present or acute for you all. Feels really good when someone opens up your present. They're like, oh, this is so awesome, thank you. I'm so happy you got this for me. The part before that, where we're buying for the gifts, and scrolling endlessly through Amazon to find the right thing, that's not as enjoyable, but the giving is good. Doing volunteering and charity, helping out friends and loved ones, these are all things that can really improve our sense of well-being, and something we want to be thinking about. Practicing mindfulness can definitely improve our well-being as well. For those who are curious about that, I'd refer you to the webinar that I did about exactly a year ago on mindfulness. I have a lot more to say about that, but basically mindfulness is a type of meditation that is focused on bringing our attention to the present moment and really savoring that experience. I'm a big fan of this one, which is working towards identifying our strengths. And one way we could do that is actually by keeping a success journal, right? Writing down a couple of things that you did well on some regular basis, whether it's on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, literally tooting your own horn, right? Saying like, wow, I did a really good job at, I don't know, changing my oil today. I barely spilled anything. I got it done quickly. What a nice job I did. That's a silly, simple example, but stuff like that. And that really can have a positive effect on our mood, because so often our attention is actually directed instead on what we did wrong or where we didn't measure up, or our weaknesses or our failings. And so it can take active effort to actually turn our attention towards our strengths and identify our successes. Developing a gratitude habit. This is one of those strategies that's really been looked at so much in positive psychology because of the really, I would say, massive effects that it can have on our well-being. Really making an effort to practice being grateful every single day. Interestingly, that's something that's like built into some religions, right? Like saying grace, for example, expressing gratitude for the things that we have on the table. That's a form of gratitude. Doing it in a secular way, it could be just keeping a journal of one or a few things that you're grateful for that day, right? Whether it's an experience that you had with someone else, maybe it's something simple like eat some Doritos today, literally anything, but just practicing the act of being grateful. The other kind of related thing to that is actually writing letters expressing gratitude to important others. The simple act of writing the letter and saying, thank you, Miss Armstrong, you were such an influence to me. I'm so grateful for everything that you did. You made me such a better writer. You were the best teacher I ever had, whatever, right? That is such a powerful lift to our own mood and well-being, even if we don't actually send the letters. Well, I strongly encourage you to do so if you do that. They will be so happy to hear from you. So I think that's a really nice thing to do. The last thing I'll say here is practicing forgiveness is another way to improve our well-being, right? And this is a hard one. What we talk about as psychologists is that forgiveness is not just about saying, what you did was okay, or I'm letting you off the hook, or I want to rekindle this relationship with you. It's about saying, I'm going to choose to let go of this toxic, negative emotions that I have towards you, this grudge that I'm holding, and I'm going to forgive you in that way. It doesn't mean I want you back in my life. It doesn't mean that, I condone what you did, but I'm not going to sit here and ruminate on, what you did to me. And of course, this is a lot easier said than done, and I could probably give a webinar on just forgiveness, but I did want to throw that out there. All right. So just real quick, I'll share these resources here. You can look at them on your own time. You have access to the handouts. You can download this. A few apps too that help, with that gratitude journaling, one that's a meditation app. A few books by the prominent researchers in this field. And lastly, 2 websites where you can learn more about positive psychology. This Coursera link here is the Yale course that supposedly is the most popular Yale course of all time in the history of the institution that really dives more deeply into positive psychology. It's called The Science of Well-Being. It's totally free for anyone to sign up and watch. I hear it's good. Actually, personally, I've not watched it yet. It's on my to-watch list, but I've heard good things, and I think it's worth checking out. All right, so that's it for kind of the main part of the presentation. I did want to do a gratitude exercise with you all. It will just take 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll have like 7 minutes for Q&A. So hopefully that works for you all. Hope folks have something where they can write some stuff down. Basically, all I want you to do is to think about your activities over the past 24 hours. Some chores that you did, if you work outside of the home, working, or inside the home these days, leisure activities, time that you spent with your family. And I want you to write down 3 things that made you feel the most satisfied, that made you feel good, gave you or gave you a sense of accomplishment. So just take I'll give folks a minute or 2 to think about that. Again, could be big or small things. Could be, the belly rub that you gave your cat this morning, or, the weird thing that your kid said at the dinner table today that made you laugh. Could be, the bag of Doritos that you ate way too much of yesterday. Not pointing any fingers at myself, but that's what I did. All right, so hopefully folks could think of 3 things. And then 1 thing that you are grateful for at this moment. Perhaps, a member of your family, perhaps your health, perhaps having employment if you're fortunate enough to still, be able to keep your job through this pandemic, being healthy, not having COVID, whatever. We can all find something to be grateful for. And all right, I'll assume most folks were able to write down some stuff. And I just want you to take this moment to just check in with yourself, like pay attention to your body for a moment and just notice how you feel as you did this. Did you feel any different? Did you feel any warmth? Did you feel a smile come on your face as you thought about some of these pleasant experiences? I'm willing to bet some of you did. And if you did enjoy it, something I encourage you to do. It's really this simple, just taking a minute or 2 out. All right, so on that note, I think we can switch to the Q&A portion. Thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shcherbakov, for that really informative presentation and that exercise towards the end. We do have just a few questions, so let's get started. So regarding the money happiness graphic that you shared, someone asked whether that was family income or individual income.
I believe that was family income.
Okay, great, thank you. And then someone has asked where they can get more information on getting trained in positive psychology. So I don't know if you do that, or there are places that people can get that training.
It's a good question. So the resources over here would be a good place to start. I guess it depends on if this person is a professional or a parent. I'm guessing a professional. The Greater Good Center at Berkeley has a lot of good resources. Martin Seligman's at UPenn, and I know he has a positive psychology, I believe he has a positive psychology center there as well. I can try to look up the information and add it to our blog.
Okay, great. I'm not sure whether the person asking is a professional or a parent. So in either case, that's helpful. What can parents do to help their kids build confidence and well-being?
Yeah, so I think going back to this PERMA model, right? So the question was about confidence and well-being. So I think, you know, a lot of confidence is really built when we're doing those things that promote flow or engagement, right? When we, you know, I think it is one of our tasks, one of our challenges in life to find one of those things that really pull us in that way, that make us feel engaged. And so, you know, helping your kid to find something like that where they feel challenged and so interested in like building up their skill as they're facing that challenge, I think is a really good way to build up their confidence. And also achievement, right? I mean, I think setting goals and achieving them gives us that sense of confidence and what's called self-efficacy as well. In terms of the, you know, the well-being, you know, more broadly, I would say thinking about all of these things for your children. You know, meaning or purpose is oftentimes not something that kids are really thinking about developmentally until they get into like early adulthood. But thinking about their relationships, their ability to achieve things, their engagement, certainly their positive emotions as well. This one tends to come pretty easily to most kids. You know, really talking with your child about what they feel like they're lacking or what they want more of. You know, helping them to reflect on their values and what really gives them that sense of deeper satisfaction besides just, you know, eating candy and playing lots of video games or watching lots of YouTube. That gives us a lot of this, but not necessarily so much of any of that, right?
Okay, great, thank you. And it is hard to make new friends when you're in middle or later age. Do you have any suggestions for fostering social connections in this phase of life?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much for that question. You know, that's something that I talk with a lot about folks who are in, you know, that middle sort of phase of life where, you know, they might have kids that are starting to get a little bit older, and it can be really hard to form new relationships. What I would recommend is, I mean, two things. One is I think middle age, as we'll call it, is a time when you can really look back and like reconnect with some former relationships that you had. You know, folks kind of drift apart when they have kids, if that's part of your experience. And, you know, towards middle age, I think there's some opportunities to rekindle some of those relationships. And technology can be really helpful for that, right? Facebook, I think when it came onto the scene, was such a cool tool to reconnect folks who had lost touch. The other thing in terms of building relationships is, you know, when you look at the things that give you a sense of meaning and give you that engagement, you will find people to form relationships with, right? If you love playing music, for example, you know, trying to join a group of folks who are also playing music, whether it's, you know, taking lessons or joining a band or whatever, right? Those are going to be really good opportunities to form those relationships. Volunteering, if that's something that speaks to you, is a good way to, you know, meet new people. If you are religious, you know, being a part of your church or synagogue or mosque or whatever community is another really good way to foster those relationships, right? You know, to build relationships, we really got to be around people like us who like similar things that we do. And so to the extent that we can put ourselves in those situations, we'll have the opportunities to build those relationships. A lot harder during COVID though, so I empathize and sympathize with that right now.
Yeah, that's certainly been a challenge for everybody. And we have someone that asked a question about techniques for short-circuiting panic attacks. So are there any ways that you can use some of these positive psychology ideas to help with panic attacks?
That's a good question. I don't know that there's any particular connection between positive psychology and panic attacks, but what I will say is that, One of the most important components to treatment for panic disorder or panic attacks is really understanding what they are. Understanding that it's part of this fight or flight process that gets kind of tripped in our brain, and the panic attacks themselves are not, dangerous. It's just sort of the body's alarm system going haywire. I think understanding that intellectually often provides some relief for folks. And then, I would encourage you to seek some professional counseling to help kind of get the other parts of that, which is the experiential facing of the fears that are triggered in panic attacks.
Okay, thank you. So we have one last question, which asked if you would consider doing a shortened version of this webinar in a different venue. And I think that I'm going to suggest that the person who asked that reach out to you directly so that you can figure out what it is that you're looking for and if that's something that that you can do. That is the end of our questions. I want to thank you again, Dr. Shcherbakov, for the really informative and helpful presentation, for taking your time this evening. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, who will do our final wrap up for the evening.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you for joining our webinar on using positive psychology to find more happiness every day. For those questions that were not answered, I will post them on the blog and have Dr. Shcherbakov answer them later. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is now open and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our site. Our next presentation, Outgrowing the Child Neurologist, Transitioning into Adulthood, will be presented by Dr. Lawrence Brown. It is scheduled for February 3rd, 2021. This ends tonight's session. Thank you, Dr. Shcherbakov, for your candid answers, and thank you everyone for attending. Good night.